Exactly. 21 years ago, I was at a Honda dealer right here nearby in Wieliczka. And from a showroom full of cars, I remembered only one car. It was the Honda Legend. And the salesman said that here, all the cars sell, all the models are popular, but this car just sits here and can't find a buyer. And if I saw it on the street now, I'd probably turn my head to look at it. The only problem is there's nothing to look at because you just don't see these cars on the street. And today, you and I will be able to take a look at such a car because Mr. Marcin will present to you what he calls the pearl of his collection. I warmly invite you.
Hi, my name is Marcin. I came from Tarnów. I wanted to present the pearl of my collection, a third-generation Honda Legend. This is a model from the year 2000 Type Series KA9 third generation of the model. The car is powered by the only naturally aspirated engine offered, a 3.5 V6 with 208 horsepower. The mileage of this particular unit is only 135,000. Basically, I've always been and still am a fan of old Japanese cars. Above all, I appreciate Honda for its achievements and the vehicles it offers. I've owned many Hondas, and for some time now, I've been dreaming of buying something with a big, naturally aspirated engine, preferably a V6. I'm familiar with the history of this particular Honda Legend because the car was owned by my mechanic for over 3 years. So I knew the history of this car very well, and I had been longing for it for 3 years since I first saw it, but I never would have guessed that one day I would become its owner. After a short casual conversation, it turned out that the car was for sale, but only for me as a Honda enthusiast. So there was no discussion about the price, there was no discussion about the terms of purchase. I just went and bought the car. Basically, you can compare this car to a Mercedes. I think it's quite a competitor for the S-Class of that time. The car is kind of in between classes, between competing with the Mercedes E-Class and the S-Class. When I pull up to a car wash or a gas station, I often get asked what kind of nice Mercedes it is. When I thank people and mention it's a Honda, not a Mercedes, they always say they've never seen one like it before. And that's a fact. Those Hondas are actually no longer on the market at all. That's why this particular car, even though it may not have the makings of a true classic, it definitely stands out first of all because of its technical condition, since this car doesn't have a trace of rust. I think it's never seen a winter, and on top of that, its mileage. I also know the history of this vehicle because I have all the documentation for it. The car came from Germany. The first owner was a gentleman born in 1923 who bought this car. He drove it all the time, covering about 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers a year, and he didn't skimp on servicing. Even though this generation of the Legend is not overly complicated, because compared to the fourth generation, which is the KB1 series, the car is much simpler. You definitely need a qualified mechanic to service this car. If we meet these two conditions, I think such a car can stay with you for life, and that's its role in my case as well.
And speaking of legends, do you remember the times when the whole automotive world revolved around one crew? Actually, it was 3 guys who could wreck any car in a way no one else would ever think of. Clarkson, Hammond, May. A trio for whom you could cancel any meeting because an afternoon with them was sacred. And from my own experience, I'll add that I know behind every funny shot there's a lot of hard work, but also friendship and chemistry between people. And that's exactly why millions of people sat down in front of their TVs. Not for the best script or the biggest budget, but for that great friendship and the magic of motoring back then. And now that good old Top Gear is coming back, the best of on BBC Breed. The best episodes every day from Monday to Friday at 5:50 p.m. For me, the biggest phenomenon of Top Gear was that they convinced hundreds of millions of people around the world that a show about cars can be pure entertainment. And that opened the way for thousands of automotive channels on YouTube, including my own channel. For that, I thank them. Welcome to BBC Breed. We're about to embark on a journey to the old magical times of motoring, and that's always worth revisiting. Because legends have this quality, they never truly disappear.
The Honda drivetrain is a classic in every sense of the word. The only engine available in this model is a V6 with a displacement of 3.5 liters. That's exactly 3,473 cubic centimeters. The engine comes from the C series. It's Honda's C series, which is basically the first V6 installed for commercial use. Engines from this series were produced from 1985 to 2005, so that's 20 years of production and engine refinement. This engine is designated as C35A2. The displacement is 3.5 liters, as I mentioned. This is the largest available engine in this series. The engine is entirely made of aluminum. As a technical curiosity, we can point out that the angle between the cylinder banks is quite unusual, because in most V-type engines, the cylinder angle is usually around 60 degrees. Here we have 90 degrees. That's why the engineers equipped the unit with a balanced shaft to minimize vibrations. The smoothness of its operation is velvet-like. Well, when you listen to this engine, it's hard to tear yourself away from it and hard not to get addicted to it. Please listen to the sound of the Japanese V6. But it runs exceptionally smoothly, and importantly, it's whitefurnia.pl, subtitles white Furnia. According to available sources, the engine produces between 205 and 212 horsepower. It seems to me whitefurnia.pl subtitles in the facelift, the power was set at 208 horsepower. What subtitles whitefurnia.pl? 1 horsepower per liter. Viewers will notice that there is no magical VVTech badge here for Honda fans, and indeed this engine doesn't have that system. When you used to drive a Honda and then switch to the Legend, you might think that this engine is from a completely different brand, because this engine has 208 horsepower and 297 Nm of maximum torque reached at 2,800 RPM, and the maximum power is achieved at 5,200 RPM. So in reality, the variable valve timing system is unnecessary here. Right from the bottom, we drive with smooth torque, and basically we don't have to press the gas pedal harder here. The layout of this car is typically Honda-like, even though Honda went completely against the trend when this car was being designed, because they equipped this vehicle with front-wheel drive. The car is relatively light for its size, because it weighs just under 1,800 kilos, which is impressive for a length of about 5 meters. It's not an excessive weight, and the weight distribution of this vehicle is very good. The car basically doesn't have any understeer at all. It drives very smoothly. And these are classic Honda DNA. On longer trips, and actually the car is really only used for longer trips, because it's not a city car, I'm able to keep the fuel consumption between 8.5 and 10 liters. Now let's move on to the description of the Legend's interior. I think the look of this interior can be described with one word: classic or even vintage. Inside, it's exceptionally comfortable, although I can't say there's an abundance of space here. However, the interior is made according to the best Honda standards. And people who have dealt with these vehicles, especially with the previous generation Accord, will definitely feel at home here. Besides, a number of buttons, a number of switches. It's typically Honda. The build quality and materials used, and let me remind you, this car first debuted in 1995, are excellent. Yes, there are some creaks and squeaks here which mostly show up when driving over short transverse bumps, which, by the way, and I'll get to that later, is probably the biggest weakness of this car. However, the look of this car lets us understand what a dashboard really is. Here we truly have a dashboard. No one makes cars like this anymore. No one builds them from materials like these, and certainly no one would equip a luxury car with such a huge steering wheel with such a thin rim. No one will make a gear lever like this anymore, one that follows the old-fashioned gear shift pattern. No one makes things like metal sun visor holders anymore. No one will make something like this either, where the radio volume knob moves when you use the steering column controls. These are things you could actually afford to do without worrying about resources or effort. The front seats are fully electrically controlled. Only the driver's lumbar support adjustment is operated manually. And here we come to basically the only typical defect in the driver's interior. Namely, in all the units I've seen, the lower casing of the passenger seat cracks. Maybe it's some kind of design flaw, or maybe it's due to some usage issue. However, the part is generally unavailable, and all the seats that are available on the market, even used ones, have this defect. So I guess I guess you just have to live with it. This is the exclusive trim version, and basically you couldn't order anything more here. Some versions also had a central locking button in this spot. Some versions had power folding mirrors, but this one does not. And some versions, although I've never actually seen one, were equipped with separate adjustment for the rear seat. Namely, adjustment for sliding, reclining, and in the armrest there was control for the audio center.
It's time for the 2-meter guy test, and I'll say right away, getting into this car, by the way, Mr. Martian also mentioned at the beginning that it's a bit similar to a Mercedes. And inside, there are quite a few of these references, on the doors, here, there. However, one thing wasn't copied from Mercedes, namely the idea of putting the seat controls on the door. Here, the seat adjustment is classic, somewhere under the seat, which means that even if you have a medium-sized watch, sliding your hand in here after closing the door is already a bit problematic. So if we want to adjust the seat, we have to open the door, and only then do we have access to the buttons. And I'll tell you, for someone who's 2 meters tall, it doesn't help at all. Right now, I'm sitting in the lowest position and as close to the steering wheel as I possibly can. The result is that, look, I'm basically looking at the road just under the edge of the sun visor and I can barely see the road. Actually, it's over this rear view mirror. As for the steering wheel, I almost fit. It's electrically adjustable here. It bends very nicely somewhere very close, so the angle changes noticeably. However, even at the maximum adjustment, a few more centimeters would be useful. Anyway, the atmosphere in this car automatically takes us back 2 decades. And it does it really effectively. And now I'm moving to the back. Let's see how much space there is on the rear seat, because that's probably the most important place in this car. And so much for my grand claims that the back here is first class. First of all, I'm 2 meters tall, so there's no headroom. And second, this seat, let me point out, it didn't move back automatically after taking out the key, it just stayed in its place. It gives me just enough space for my knees. I can't say I'm too cramped, but I also can't say there's a few centimeters to spare. And honestly, for such an impressively large limousine, there's less space inside than I expected.
The manufacturer states the trunk capacity is around 450 liters, and I think that's not an exaggeration. The trunk could use a few more handles and hooks. We have one hook and one compartment on the right side. The rear seat doesn't fold down because in such a luxurious car it's simply not appropriate. There's a ski pass-through with a fairly large opening, so if you need to transport something longer it's not a problem. And a guitar fits lengthwise. So the car is very spacious. I don't know why the Japanese stubbornly refuse to install a handle for closing the trunk in their cars. I don't understand that, and it's something I'll have to add myself. Under the trunk floor, we have a compartment for a spare wheel, which is also important. It's a full-size wheel on a 5th alloy rim, so nobody skimped on that either. Here, the lower strip by the window is a bit worn out by the passage of time, and I've been looking for it for a long time. Unfortunately, it's impossible to find. Similarly, the chrome parts in the bumper are hard to get. They reach astronomical prices at auctions. I recently managed to buy an original front windshield seal for the Legend, which is also supposedly impossible to find. Therefore, when you have such a car, you have to regularly search forums and the secondary market, and stock up on whatever you can.
And I had to wait 2 decades from walking around the car in the showroom and admiring it to the moment when I could finally drive it. I remember that the salesperson's comment in the showroom was that this car is absurdly expensive, and because of that, nobody wants it anymore. I don't know how much it must have cost in the early 2000s, but probably over 200,000 or so. Compared to that, back then a Focus probably costs around 30,000 fully loaded. So it must have been an incredibly expensive car, really. So far what you said is 100% true. There isn't any. There's no such urge from the car itself to make you want to drive it faster. This car is so calm by nature that even when I press the gas, it reluctantly revs up to higher RPMs. Of course, if I floored it, which I'll probably have a chance to do in a moment when we get out,
but it'll drop down 2 gears and we'll go.
but it delays that moment as much as possible because it assumes, hey, you're never really in a hurry.
No, absolutely not. You shouldn't be in a hurry with this car. That's also why we can keep the fuel consumption under control. Like I said, 8.5 liters on the road is actually a very decent result. Well, the city kills it because this old torque converter automatic that's always slipping takes away a lot of power. And in the city, the fuel consumption increases drastically. I think you could easily get around 15 liters. I should mention that I haven't driven it enough to really check. The tank holds 68 liters, so filling up hurts. But you don't talk about money when it comes to this car.
Right. I don't know if, given the uniqueness of this particular car, we'll risk doing the Moose test.
We can try. We can take the risk. Yes, after all, it's a Honda. The tires are a bit outdated because here we have the basic 16-inch tires. So in fact, that's something you hardly ever see anymore, maybe not even on city cars anymore. The profile is also quite unusual because it's 215/55 on 16-inch wheels. Well, the tires were definitely designed mainly with driving comfort in mind, not with sporty performance in mind.
Well, there wasn't a decisive downshift here, it was rather smooth. But it's like with Honda, the higher it revs, the more it wants to go. But this kind of smooth power delivery, that's something that wasn't here before.
The refinement is interesting. The way this engine runs is just amazing. Every Honda, whether it's a 4-cylinder Honda or a V-engine Honda, is unmatched when it comes to smoothness.
And I think the best was still ahead of us because it was just starting to rev up around 4,000 and there was still about 1,000 left.
There was still some reserve left. Well, the maximum power is at 5,200, so there's still some room ahead of us. But in normal driving, we really just use the torque, like in a good diesel.
Because here it barely reaches 1,000.
1,000 actually. I should mention I previously had a 9th generation Civic with Honda Zone Automatic, which was a 5-speed. And definitely in the Legend, even though this transmission is a 4-speed and certainly much older in design, the transmission controller works much better. It flawlessly reads the driver's intentions and changes the shift points. It's noticeable that if someone buys a Honda, they stick with the brand and drive that car for a very long time. Although they could switch and afford another car, they have no reason to change. I would also really like to see the 8th generation Accord in my garage, but I just don't have anywhere to keep these cars anymore. So there are a lot of cars that I would like to have. Well, usually they're all Japanese cars. But I think the Legend is like the fulfillment of every dealer's dream, every Honda fan's dream.
Now I floored it from a lower speed and it interpreted my acceleration completely differently. Because when we were going a bit faster and I pressed the pedal, it assumed I had more time and accelerated more smoothly. Here, I pressed the pedal from a low speed and it downshifted completely differently, much more abruptly. Exactly. I was waiting at 5,000 RPM, it did it in a lower gear. Much shorter, of course. Now I'm driving, for example, 50 kilometers and honestly I feel like I could get out because we're just standing still. Alright, we're at 50 km/h, we have an empty road, no one's driving. It was swaying, no.
It was swaying.
The tires were floating, the tires were definitely the weakest point, then there was a long gap. I'm not even talking about the tires, sidewalls flexing, because that was...
I'm just talking about the grip.
I'm just talking about the grip that they let go and weren't all that great. However, the car was also suspended softly enough that it leaned quite noticeably. But it gave all the control to the driver because there was no electronic intervention. And secondly, the steering system worked very pleasantly, which, considering such a big steering wheel, it wasn't obvious at all that with such a turn, without having to move your hands, it really bounced strongly to the left. That's really a good ratio. I would say no, not like in those limousines where you have to turn the wheel 3 times one way and 3 times the other. It bounced back honestly, and that's one thing. And secondly, when we were returning to our position, we had to go through the 0 point. There was no resistance at all. It went very smoothly to the other side.
Well, that's good hydraulics. I agree about the tires. I bought the car with summer tires, which were really focused on dry asphalt. They behaved terribly on wet surfaces. So here, as a compromise, I got myself, well, generally all-season tires. Because while I don't plan to drive this car in worse conditions, I can't rule out that someday I might have to. So I think it's quite reasonable in the case of this car, but I feel that the handling of the car has changed, unfortunately a bit for the worse.
I'll just add that if anyone is planning to comment here asking for photos of what it looked like from the outside, I'll say there won't be any such photos because we won't be repeating that maneuver a second time. Because maybe it wasn't on the edge of risk, but this car, because of the tires, didn't perform as well as I thought it would. So there won't be any photos from the outside.
Only the owner's terrified face will remain. That will have to suffice instead of outside photos.
As it's the jewel, it must be in the collection. What interesting things do you have in your collection?
The collection is modest. I think on the other side we have a Starlet P9 from 1996, a car that was also featured by one of the automotive YouTubers last year. A car that nobody wanted, that nobody was looking for, but everyone loves it. So because of its technical condition, it also deserves to be preserved in its current state. Personally, for some time now, as I said, I've mainly been driving Hondas. However, I'm not limiting myself only to Hondas. My daughter drives a 9th generation Civic, which I used to drive before. My wife, because she usually drives short distances, uses a Yaris hybrid, which is perfect for that. It's really the king of the city. However, for the past 6 months, I've gotten myself a very interesting car, a Lexus RX from the 2nd generation of hybrids. That's the 400h version. And I'm also really taken with this car. So it's the kind of car I use for everyday driving. I joke that the average age of my cars is 25 years for the Legend, 18 years for the Lexus, and 29 for the Starlet. But to be honest, I don't worry about it at all because the cars are always ready to drive. Like I said, my love for cars always wins. You can afford to buy such cars in good condition, and most importantly, to keep them in that same good condition, because these cars are made by engineers, not by accountants.
I'll come back to the period when this car was being designed. And here I have to refer to the suspension, which I have no doubt is in the condition that the restorer intended. However, the way it handles short bumps is, let's say, not as stable as in today's cars. When it hits small bumps like, I don't know, a manhole cover or short transverse ridges, it just flies over them. Yes, as if you get the feeling that the wheel's contact with the road isn't that stable. As if it were a car designed about 20 years later.
Later, I would say it's unworthy of this car because those transverse bumps are clearly transmitted into the cabin. And that's probably my only complaint about this suspension. Well, it shows that this is a car made for swallowing up long distances on highways. But for example, Lexus, which I already mentioned earlier and which is also older in terms of design, provides incomparably higher driving comfort. Transverse bumps and manhole covers completely disappear in the suspension, the tires, and the seats of this car. So in that respect, there's a big difference.
To sum up, the only limitation of the collection is the size of the garage.
And finances, of course. That's an obvious thing.
Everyone has some financial limitations. However, these cars, let's say in an age range similar to Legend, if they're not total gems, are usually not extremely expensive. It's more about the costs of maintaining such a car than actually buying it. But if it were another car for the collection, it would also be something from Japan.
Yes, definitely from Japan. I think that after getting to know the Lexus brand better and appreciating it, I would like to have something from the Lexus lineup. I'm not talking about the LS, which is a pipe dream, but would a regular LC be enough? That would be fine. I'd gladly take it. I'd gladly take it, no problem. No need to think about it. These cars pretty much come to me on their own. Maybe it's some kind of luck with cars. Maybe it's because I always try to help everyone with their car troubles, and maybe that's how it comes back to me. However, most of these cars are found completely by accident. I'm not the kind of person who spends months looking for cars, spending a lot of money driving all over Poland, only to end up disappointed and back at square one. Somehow it's easy for me to acquire these cars, but like I said, you also have to measure your ambitions and set an appropriate budget. The Legend is definitely not a car for a beginner driver. It's not a car for someone who spends their last dollar on a car. You can't buy this car without technical knowledge and a passion for cars, for detailing, because with this car you can do a lot of things yourself. And it's definitely not a car that could be used as a daily driver. It's just too precious for that. Apart from the fuel costs, this car is really too precious to use in city traffic. So it's a car you can sigh over, dream about, and one you need to mature into at a certain stage of life. And if you get the chance, it's worth buying. Buying large, naturally aspirated engines is worthwhile since they won't return.
So congratulations, Martin, on reaching that level of maturity, so to speak.
Chasing the goal won't make you win.
Yes, for that particular car, because I think that ride was pure pleasure for me.
I'm very glad.
Thanks for presenting the car.
Thank you very much.
Thank you also for watching this episode. Remember to subscribe. See you in the next videos.
Bye.